So I'm going to start here by going over biomarkers for health risk assessment. And today and then the next time that we get together on Saturday, I'm going to be going over very specific things that we look at in the body and how the body works and functions to try and give you the best idea on what you can do to create and build better health, reverse aging, slow down the decaying process. We've been talking already about some food. We've been talking about the nature of oils and ultra-processed foods, and we talked about time-restricted eating. We talked about doing some cleanses, and I find that it's best to do an approach where we figure out some of the solutions, and then we talk about some of the challenges or problems. This way, when we have the challenges or problems presented, we already know what kind of solutions that there should be. I find that it's just an easier mentally to get into it. So this and then the next one that we talk about are generally the presentations that we do that cause people to be like, oh my gosh, I have to make a change going forward. Right? So this is health risk assessment. These are biomarkers. We're going to talk about physical markers in the future, but these are the biomarkers. These are things that can be measured looking at our biology, right? So our temperature would be a biomarker, our cholesterol level would be a biomarker. These are health risk assessment biomarkers, and these are ones that we use typically for people who are interested in reversing aging. We don't oftentimes see these done in a typical medical office, and the reason for that is because there aren't really any drugs or treatment methods from a medical standpoint to reverse these. These are markers that we look at that tend to change before disease sets in, and most medical professionals, not that there's anything bad with their approach, this is just their approach, is to address disease process once it's there, right? So we're looking to undo disease process before it starts to become a disease process, right? So this here is our waist circumference and insulin resistance. This is probably the biggest idea that we're going to talk about regarding biomarkers, and it's insulin resistance, insulin, the way that our body monitors blood sugar, the way that our body deals with blood sugar, the way that our body deals with energy production. And one marker that we do look at that we don't talk about specifically here in one slide, but it's an overall arching, is the amount of visceral fat or belly fat or abdominal fat that we have. And this here shows they're listed as adipocytes. And you can see here the term adipocyte as well. And again, all these videos are available on the Practice Better, and the slides are much bigger, so you're able to see them on the Practice Better. But these adipocytes are fat cells, right? And as we increase the number of fat cells, but more importantly, as we increase the content of each fat cell, we develop more and more visceral fat. And visceral fat is directly tied to our insulin resistance and our morbidity and our mortality. So waist circumference is an excellent proxy for overfilled adipocytes or full fat cells. Waist to height ratio predicts insulin resistance. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So overfilled adipocytes cause insulin resistance. It makes the body more resistant to insulin. In other words, if the body wants to store sugar into cells, get sugar out of the bloodstream, the body needs insulin to do that. The more that you become resistant to insulin, the more resistant you need. It's like having an alcohol resistance. And when you were a kid, you drank 2 sips of beer, you were a little tipsy, and maybe in college it took you 2 12-packs to get drunk because you build resistance, right? So the same thing, the more that you stimulate the body with insulin, the more resistant you get, the harder it is to control blood sugar values, right? This here shows that glucose and fat are oxidized reciprocally in mitochondria. It means that the mitochondria, are only able to do one at a time. So we're going to go on to the next slide here. How to do a waist measurement. I'd like you to be able to start taking your waist measurements now. As much as the scale is an easy way to monitor our weight, I prefer us to monitor our waist, because our waist will give us an idea of how much visceral fat we have, and our waist will give us an idea of how much our body is changing. If we're putting on lean body mass, if we're putting on muscle, we're going to see maybe an increase in weight, even though it's not a bad thing. We want to monitor our waist so that we know how much our body fat or how much visceral fat we have. So we stand up straight, we exhale all the way, we take a cloth tape measure. If you don't have one, buy one on Amazon, they're a couple of bucks, and then measure around your waist, above your hip bones, above your belly button, below your ribs, at the smallest, thinnest part of the waist. This diagram here, this picture here, shows somebody measuring a little low. She should be measuring up at about this rate. And then hold the tape measure flat against the body, not tight so it's cutting in, but measure around the waist and take that measurement. Now we're going to use that measurement for two different things. The first thing we're going to do is use a waist to height ratio. So we take our waist measurement, which, let's say if we're 5'10", right? Because it's an easy number. That's 70 inches. We're going to put that underneath our height. And then we're going to take our waist measurement and we're going to put it up here, right? So we're going to measure the waist here and then the height here. For a female, we want that number to be below 0.49. We usually say 0.48 is where we're looking for that number. So if we're 5'10", which is 70 inches, and your waist is lower than 35 inches, so 35 inches would be a 0.5. So if it's 34 inches, 34 and a half, you're going to be in this healthy realm. As a male, we're a little bit more forgiving with the amount, but that's what we're going to look at. So use your calculator. You're going to divide your waist measurement by your height measurement. We do not use BMI to help measure these. Also, there's some restrictions here. If you're a child, we have a different chart. If you're under 5 foot, there are different different readings that we're going to have. But most of our people that we work with are over 5 feet. We do not use BMI because BMI is a false predictor. That's a height to weight measurement. I'm going to give you two examples. Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was Mr. Universe, his BMI was based on his weight at 235 and his height, I believe, was 6'3". Donald Trump in 2018, when he was president, 6'3", 235. So they both weighed 235, 6'3", but they had very different body shapes. They both had the same BMI. So we do not use BMI. We use our waist to height ratio. We also use a waist to hip ratio. Now this is generally a little bit more accurate for long term. So we measure around the waist here, same spot, but then we measure around the hips. And the hips, we choose the widest spot. And again, waist is on top, hips are down below. And if the waist measurement is 35 and the hip measurement is 45, right? So for women, we want that to be 0.8 or below to be in a low risk. And for men, we want that to be 0.95 or below to be in a low risk. And again, we're going to look at these the waist to hip measurements, and this is going to account for the curviness of people, right? Some people, are curvier than others. So we're looking at the overall visceral fat, how much organ fat we have, and that's a proxy for our insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is going to cause a tremendous number of problems in the body, right? So here we have a slide about insulin resistance. If we're eating an ultra-processed diet, here eating maybe a Chick-fil-A sandwich, maybe some McDonald's burgers, maybe a shake from Wendy, I don't know, but it's an ultra-processed diet. This is going to cause an increase in glucose in the blood, constantly high levels of glucose in the blood. The body does not want to have unregulated glucose in the blood. We have a very narrow window of glucose in the blood that we can maintain to keep us alive and healthy so we don't go into a diabetic coma or insulin shock, right? It's a very narrow window. This high level of glucose in the blood is going to create a constant high insulin demand. This insulin demand is going to overwork the pancreas. The pancreas is now required to constantly put out a lot of insulin, a lot of insulin, a lot of insulin to bring down the glucose level. Over time, this decreases the sensitivity in the cell to insulin. The cell's like, oh my gosh, more insulin, more insulin. How much are we going to have to deal with? So it takes more and more and more. This creates high glucose levels in the body, even though there's high insulin levels in the body. So glucose levels stay high, even though insulin levels are going up. And then glucose isn't getting into the cell, it's staying in the bloodstream. This insulin in the bloodstream, this high glucose in the bloodstream creates inflammatory change in the body. Free-flowing sugars, glucose in the body is very inflammatory, and it creates a whole host of problems we're going to talk about in a moment. We've already talked about the last couple of weeks. But this also creates an increase in hunger and cravings because we're not able to get the sugar into the cell, and the cell uses the sugar for energy, and then you're going to constantly be hungry because the cell's like, I'm starving, and then this gives you a push back toward eating more, and it just keeps going around and around and around and around. So insulin resistance, this is a very important concept right here. The relationship between insulin and glucose and type 2 diabetes. Excuse me. During normal function, we should have insulin resistance maintaining low. We should have our insulin levels low and our blood glucose levels low, or not low, but steady state. Insulin begins to rise when our body has an inability to regularly maintain blood sugar as insulin resistance goes up. So diabetes actually begins right when the body says, look, I'm having a hard time managing my insulin levels. I need to start increasing our insulin production. This is where diabetes begins. And intervention should begin as soon as we notice, hey, our insulin levels are increasing. What can we do about it? As insulin levels go up, and this is many, many years along this path here, intervention should begin here, but our glucose numbers remain the same. They remain steady. We do not see an increase in glucose levels. You go to your doctor, yeah, your glucose is fine, A1C is fine, you don't have diabetes, don't worry, keep eating the burgers and fries. Right? As glucose levels begin to rise, hey, you know what, your glucose is going up a little bit, why don't you just start eating a little bit better? That's generally the medical treatment, the medical advice. There's no real intervention here. But we can see numbers going up and up and up. By the time that we see our numbers going higher, our ability to regulate blood sugar is way off the chart. Our insulin levels begin to drop because our pancreas is overworked. We see these glucose numbers rising precipitously. Oh my gosh, now we have diabetes, and now we begin treatment. But this diabetes diagnosis might have taken 2, 3, 4 decades to occur after we saw the initial onset. So controlling diabetes is number one, and we do that through controlling insulin. So insulin is one biomarker that we look at. We do look at glucose, A1C. We'll talk about that in a moment. But specifically, insulin is a biomarker that we look at. And this is just a little bit bigger picture of what we just saw. But again, you'll see those loads. So relationship of fasting insulin levels to relative risk for multiple metabolic disorders. So when we go back here, here we go. When we go back here, we can see insulin going up, but blood sugar is staying the same. We see in an 8-year incidence, if you have insulin levels begin to rise, you're 5.5 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. You're double the risk of developing hypertension or high blood pressure. And then having a cholesterol readings out of normal range, you're 3.5 times more likely to have triglycerides in the blood, and having your cholesterol 1.5 times more likely to be out of range. Uric acid. This is another one that we study, that we test for in the office, and we test for uric acid because uric acid is associated with insulin resistance and insulin deficiency. And the reason for that is because of fructose and other loads on the liver, dietary loads on the liver, meat, fish, alcohol, obesity, and high sugar on the liver is going to stimulate the liver to produce uric acid. So we use uric acid as a marker to tell us if the liver is under load. And we hear about fatty liver, we hear about liver failure, cirrhosis, and by the time we start doing regular liver enzyme tests to look for the liver, problem, we're already deep into liver disorder. Now, we can see some of these if we do an ultrasound or a scan of the liver, but it's expensive, time-consuming. Uric acid is relatively inexpensive and not that time-consuming, because uric acid in system circulation leads to insulin resistance and leads to insulin deficiency from the pancreas. So it's another lab that we run in the office. We also look at GGT, and GGT is an enzyme that's gamma-glutamyltransferase. Back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we knew that it was a marker of liver disease, and we couldn't really tell more than that because just the technology hadn't caught up. But we knew that it meant that there was some problem, some level of dysfunction. Now we know that GGT is a high marker of cardiometabolism problems, cardiometabolic risk. It is still associated with the liver, but we know that when we see elevated GGT levels, we know that the liver is under load. We also know that the cardiovascular system is under load, and you're more likely to develop diabetes, and that's because of the antioxidant stress that's on the body when we see GGT being released into the system. Again, another very low expensive test, a very high precision for cardiovascular risk, and it's something that we can treat with life interventional methods, lifestyle treatment, but it's not something that we're able to really give, oh, hey, take this pill, right? Which is why we don't see tested for in the medical office so much. We also look at the hemoglobin A1C, HbA1c, and the reason that we look for this is because it tells us what our blood sugars have been over the last 120 days. A red blood cell lives for about 120 days, and if blood sugar is high, we see glucose attaching itself to the hemoglobin in the red blood cell. When there's more sugar in the blood, there's more glucose that's attaching to the red blood cells, right? So the higher your hemoglobin content of blood sugar, the glycolysis into it's glycolated hemoglobin, where the glucose attaches to the protein, we know that your blood sugars have been running high. Now, I have this chart on here because it shows if your hemoglobin A1C is above 6.5%, you have diabetes, right? Well, does that mean if your hemoglobin is 6.42%, you don't have diabetes, you're in the clear? You're pre-diabetic? Does that mean if your hemoglobin A1C is at 5.67, you're normal, but at 5.7, you're pre-diabetic? These are ranges, and if we can look to see how these change over time, it's much better than looking at a specific level, right? Here, level of C-reactive protein in the blood. We use a high specificity C-reactive protein, or a high specific C-reactive protein, which is HS-CRP, which is different from regular CRP, but essentially it measures the inflammatory change in the body. A normal coronary artery is not going to produce C-reactive protein. As plaque builds up in the artery, we see C-reactive protein increasing more and more and more. And then as inflammation advances, we can see very high levels. C-reactive protein is a very good indicator for impending heart attack, impending cardiovascular event, and it also tells us the overall health of the body from an inflammatory standpoint and cardiovascular. And as we look to see these numbers rise, we see risk increasing as well, which is why we look for a C-reactive protein. A simple blood test that can save your life. We know that high C-reactive protein goes up, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, Crohn's, sleep apnea, rheumatoid arthritis. All these we see increasing C-reactive protein, which is why it's a clinical test that we do in the office. Here's one also that we run, which is a sedimentation rate, erythrocyte sedimentation rate, right down here. And the SED rate, or as it's known as SED rate, tells us how quickly your red blood cells fall. And what we see is an increase in speed with which the cells sink in the test tube is associated with an increase in inflammation. Inflammatory disease, infections, autoimmune. We do see it in cancer, viral infections, pregnancy, but the more that you have these markers that show us inflammation, the more that we know that the body is under significant load and stress. And we're most concerned at this point now with the load and the stress on the cardiovascular system, on the bloodstream, and how it affects the body's ability to regulate normal body functions. Right, so we're going to talk a little bit about cholesterol here. Now, cholesterol is another one that we do test in the office, but we look at it differently from the regular, oh my gosh, your cholesterol levels are within normal range. Well, this person here, this is showing 100 milligrams per deciliter of cholesterol, right? But this has 5 units of cholesterol, or particles of cholesterol. This has 10 particles of cholesterol that both weigh the same amount. So if you have 100 milligrams per deciliter, it tells us the overall weight of the cholesterol, but it doesn't tell us about the cholesterol itself, right? So you can have 100 pounds of bricks, 100 pounds of feathers. We still have 100 pounds, but they're two totally different things, right? So same cholesterol level, different numbers of cholesterol particles. Why does that matter? Because particle size will determine how it affects your blood vessels. So small, dense LDL particles, low-density lipoprotein particles, can easily slip between your endothelial cells, gain access to the inside of the wall where they can cause damage and plaquing. So these small particles can get into these nooks and crannies and create inflammatory change, or not create inflammatory change, but associated with the inflammatory change, and create damage. These large particles, they just bounce around. They can't get through the wall. They can't get into the arterial lining and cause problem, right? So it does matter our particle size. So we like to look at particle size because here's Jerry, Susan, David, and Maria. They all have the same cholesterol level of 125 milligrams per deciliter, but Jerry, low relative risk. Maria, high relative risk because Jerry only has 1 particle, Maria has 8 particles. Hers are able to get in and damage the vessels, not like Jerry's, right? So pattern A, low density lipoprotein. So we like to look at the density, the low density lipoproteins, the size. How big or how small are they, right? So this is something we look at in the office. We look at particle size. Particle size study is going to set apart normal cholesterol. Well, my doctor tests cholesterol. Why don't they test particle size? There's no treatment for particle size other than lifestyle medicine, interventional approaches through changing how you live and function, right? So ApoB protein is one of the markers that we look at to see how many particles we have. ApoB protein carries the low density lipoprotein. So if we have a lot of ApoB protein, we know that we must have a high number of particles because each particle has to be carried by this protein. So the more particles we have, the higher the ApoB protein. The fewer particles we have, the lower the ApoB protein. So this tells us what we we can infer particle size based on this. And this is a number we can change through intervention, right? We also look at plaque, PLAC, which is lipoprotein PLA2. Stable plaques don't produce the lipoprotein PLA2. Unstable plaques, plaques that are prone to detachment, breaking a thrombus, or having a vascular event, will start releasing this. So this is a great marker for us to determine what your relative risk is for an impending heart attack or cardiovascular event. Again, it's not often tested in a doctor's office. It's relatively inexpensive to do, and it can save your life because it'll cause you to say, "Oh my gosh, let me have an intervention here." Right? A lipoprotein A, just another test that we do in the office. It shows us how much of a restriction there might be in your blood vessels. As blood flow is restricted and blood vessels are narrow, we see lipoprotein A building up. Right? This is for artery disease. It shows us that C-reactive protein increases as the artery becomes damaged. We see lipoprotein A increasing. We can see tests, even though like non-invasive tests are normal, where we can see the blood. Yeah, look, your blood vessels are fine, but we can see the beginning stages of blood vessel disease. We can see the beginning stages of blood vessel disease, even though we're testing normal. The same thing with diabetes. So we want to look back as far as we can to try to determine, are we on the path and how far on the path are we? this helps us to focus on anti-aging, right? Another thing that we look at is heart rate variability. We talked about this when we talked about using a Fitbit, a Whoop, an Oura Ring, or an Apple Watch to look at your heart rate variability. This tells us how much our body is able to maintain a good building, rest, and repair, rebuilding and repairing. And it measures the time between each heartbeat, right? So this shows that each heartbeat is variable, and that's the heart rate variability. So if we look here, we can see this, there's very little heart rate variability here. Every heartbeat is 1 second apart. Here we can see some of the heartbeats are 0.93 seconds, some of them are 1.2, 1.3. So the more that we have a high heart rate variability, the more we're able to have greater performance, greater adaptability, better cognition, better brain function. And this is something that we do want to see occurring as heart rate variability. And you can easily monitor this at home. It just takes, you buy a device and you monitor it all the time. So these are the biomarkers that we look at when we try to measure change over time. We have here, this is a slide is available for you as well, much bigger, but it shows the risk assessment blood testing. So we do a CBC with differential, the CardioPro Basic, a comprehensive metabolic panel, the particle size study, and then we use sedimentation rate, uric acid, GGT, and your hemoglobin A1C, and it shows just the pricing on it. Here, the total price is less than $200 if you don't have any insurance, but it's so valuable. It's so valuable. It's less than what you'd spend on a night of a hotel going away somewhere. But knowing this information could allow you to have the health to go on many, many trips in the future, not dying of a heart attack.